Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is Scott Bradfield out of the bathtub, and this is our first new broadcast since 2019. I did a little thing on A. Van Vogt, which I filmed before I left for holidays, and today I'm kind of catching up with all these little things I've been reading here and there, and I've talked in the past couple of months about how I've sort of kind of gained a sort of either an adolescent or a mature enjoyment of horror fiction. I've never been a fan of horror fiction in the past, and I've kind of been lured into this huge realm of prose and writing and fiction by first Clark Ashton Smith, who we did a piece on several months ago, who I think is one of the most interesting California writers I've ever read. Really a very, very exotic, strange, otherworldly writer who basically creates landscapes with words, just peculiar and bizarre landscapes. And he's been around a long time, and he strikes me as a really interesting writer and artist. And I've long made fun of H.P. Lovecraft. Never could read him. Always considered him the pinnacle of bad writing. And through his friendship with Clark Ashton Smith, and by reading a book, a novel based on Lovecraft's life, and I've just forgotten it, but I talked about it in one of the Christmas broadcasts. Paul Laforgue, I want to say, The Night Ocean, which is a novel about Lovecraft's and his relationship with a young man when he was growing older and before he died. And I enjoyed that book. And I've gone back and started, and S.T. Joshi, I don't want to forget him. His really interesting, lovely set of books through Penguin, really well annotated, well selected, well proofread. I can't tell you how there's so many badly proofread versions of H.P. Lovecraft. These are really nice additions. And so I've been reading Lovecraft, and I'm performing a mea culpa. I kind of like Lovecraft. I hate to sound like I've been making fun of people for liking Lovecraft. This is the volume I read over the past couple of months. It's called The Call of Cthulhu. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but Call of Cthulhu. And there's something about the language. It looks ridiculous when you first see Lovecraft. And one of the things I always found a bit difficult about him was this constant discussion of unnameable horrors, and everything it's incomprehensible terror, and everything is described as this highfalutin language, which is not that scary when you hear it. And as I was reading through this book, it's kind of an interesting volume. So Penguin through S.T. Joshi has produced 3 or 4 volumes. I think it has pretty much everything of Lovecraft's. He only wrote one novel length piece, which I haven't read yet. And these are mainly, this takes you through his career from some of the early stories, such as something called Herbert West Reanimator, which are a pretty funny series of stories about a guy who reanimates dead bodies. And it's actually, they're pretty funny. And there's 4 or 5 short pieces in there. And the stories are fairly short at the beginning of this book, before they develop into much the longer, more moody and controlled, lengthy stories in which you slowly kind of experience this mounting dread of this universe, which in Lovecraft, which is completely inimical, I think I want to say, to human life. It just basically is eating it all up. It doesn't have any concerns for you. And there's no good forces in the universe. And that's basically what the characters sort of develop as understanding of. Some of these, what I like about Lovecraft is I really thought he was more in your face when I read him in the past, with these kind of again, hyper hysterical ramblings of the horror coming into your house. And he's a much more controlled, sensible writer than that, from what I can see through reading this book. He's very, very careful, particularly in the late stories, of divorcing his narrators and his narrative voice from the actual action of the horror. So, for example, we often get much of the horrors are coming to us through reports that the narrators, who are sometimes academics, they often go to, I think they're at Miskatonic, there's some weird university in Massachusetts, and sometimes they're academics, or the people who start to correspond, or the people who kind of visit a town, and are getting stories of what's happening through the local residents. So they're not really in the action, but they're finding these things out. In one of the early stories that I quite liked, again, the setups are sort of preposterous, but I did like it. There's a story, I think it's called it's the one about Randolph Carter. The Statement of Randolph Carter. It's very short, early, kind of crude Lovecraft. And a guy decides that dead bodies are being taken under the earth by some sort of creatures. And he decides to dig underneath a buried body, and he takes a telephone with him with a huge long extension cord. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's the premise of the story, and it's a very clever premise in a way. So the narrator of the story is back home listening on the other side of this phone, or this crude, for the time, intercom system with a long cord. And basically, I don't want to tell too much about the story, but the character who goes into the grave is taken off by these creatures that live underneath the earth. And as he's being dragged into the earth, you can hear him in the voice screaming. You can't describe it. It's really horrible. It's kind of it sounds corny, but because he's out of your view, it's beyond your comprehension, then that kind of creepiness and the inexplainability of this horror is quite effective. Anyway, I quite enjoyed these stories. The longer stories start to get into something called the Call of Cthulhu. Right? He's famous for all these Cthulhu stories, and the premise is that there's this race. I think they're all over the place. They're maybe in the earth or they're outer space. I forget completely, and they're kind of linked with many of these horrors. I didn't really like the Call of Cthulhu as much. The one that really kind of got me into him was The Color Out of Space. This is kind of a science fiction story idea, and it's basically something crashes under the earth into this town in the past, and a contemporary archivist or researcher is trying to find out what happened in this town and why it became so horrible and why everyone died off. And he goes back and researches it and finds out about how this from one of these stones that crashed down to earth, a color emerged, a color you couldn't quite describe, and it starts to infect everything. That's a really most effective story, and the way Lovecraft distances you from the actual events, and you get it through all these reports. The other one I really liked was The Whisperer in Darkness. Similar sense where we're getting an academic researching into these events, some horrible events in the past. And again, there's a lot of strange ideas in this. Ultimately, the strangest, which is that human brains are translated into these kind of recordings, and that is eternity for them, and that's about the best eternity you can get in Lovecraft, which is basically eternal awfulness. He's pretty consistent. So anyway, I enjoyed that one. I enjoyed The Shadow over Innsmouth a lot. Not as much. That's one with these kind of, again, many of them have relations to this eternal race of evil, but there's these creatures that live in the ocean or something, and some young kid who gets involved with them. So, and The Haunter of the Dark. I think my favorites were The Whisper in Darkness and The Color Out of Space, where I think that sense, that mood that he establishes at the beginning of the story, and that sense that all this is happening in the past or be outside of our recognition, and as the characters, the central characters, get closer to the actual awfulness, it's effective by the time you get to that point. So a much better writer than I expected. I will definitely read the rest of the Lovecraft editions that Joshi has produced through Penguin, and I will be looking into many of the other writers who I don't know as well, who influenced Lovecraft over the next few years. I've really enjoyed kind of discovering, I'm the last to discover these characters, but interesting writers, and particularly interesting American writers of their periods. Okay, so Lovecraft, he's great in the bathtub. He really works in the bathtub, and we'll talk to you really soon about a non-horrific. Well, I take that back. It may be horrific. I think we're going to finish Beckett. I can't think any more horrific than Beckett, but he kind of fits in with this whole crowd. Okay, we'll talk to you soon. Happy bathing, and eminently bathtubable. I think that's my new phrase. Eminently bathtubable. The H.P. Lovecraft editions from Penguin, all in print.